Hi, this is Philip Martin. Today I'll be testing a variety of different mats for use in cutting practice. These mats were sent to me by the pikeman shop. Some of them are beech mats, some of them are Wara. One of them is very similar to Mugen Dachi. So I'll begin with the beech mats. Beech mats are a fairly well-known commodity within the martial arts community. They're generally not considered to be a good cutting target because they do not provide good feedback as to whether or not your cut was performed well. The main reason is they're just too easy to cut. After being soaked for 12 hours, the mats are just too soft, too easy to cut. You want a mat to give you feedback on whether or not you had proper edge alignment, whether or not you generated sufficient tip velocity, used proper structure. So if the mat's too easy to cut through, it's not helping you very much. Here I am using a 13-inch knife to just cut through the beech mat. And here you'll see the issue is after only about 12 hours of soaking, the mats become very squishy and soft and spongy, and they're just not a sufficiently dense and sturdy material for a cutting medium. Here I'll demonstrate just a short distance cut that was performed mostly with my wrist, and here again a rising cut which would not have cut a Mugen Dachi mat. And here again I'll spike the piece and cut it with a knife, and here I'm showing that it's very lightweight, doesn't have the density that you would want in a cutting target. Here I'm going to attempt to do this all with wrist and forearm, and it cuts just nice and cleanly through. So and on this final mat, after this vercal, I'll demonstrate again just how easily the mat is cut by simply flicking the sword forward through the mat, essentially with my wrist. And here you can see I cut almost halfway through the mat just with the upward motion of my wrist raising the sword. So it's just too easy to cut through. And now the Wara Mats. For those of you used to seeing me perform very clean cuts in my videos, you won't be seeing much of that here. I'm going to be purposely performing poor cuts and seeing what kind of feedback I get from the mats. That's a Mugen Dachi mat on the left and a Wara mat on the right, and I'm performing a vercal far too close to the mat and cutting about the midpoint of the blade, and so the Mugen Dachi punished that. The Wara did not. Here I'm going to do a cut mainly with my arms, very little hip motion, and you'll see the scalloped mat now, whereas it cuts nice and cleanly through the Wara. Here I will hold the sword in one hand very loosely. That's what I'm showing here, a very loose grip, and you'll see that the sword went down, trying to stay in the mat, taking the path of least resistance, whereas the Wara cuts cleanly through again. So this is a case where Mugen Dachi will give you better feedback as to what you're doing wrong with your cut. Thinking of another poor cut to do. So what I'm going to do here is not engage my core, just a floppy, no power cut. Goes about 2/3 of the way through on both those cuts, pretty consistent. And the same thing on the Wara, right through. I have to do a pretty poor cut not to get all the way through. In this next video, I'll be cutting two virtually identical Wara Mats of the kind that we've been seeing recently in HEMA tournaments. One issue I'd like to discuss here while we're watching me do some cuts, and I'll start doing some poor cuts. One justification I've heard for using these mats is that beginners will find them hard to cut because the mat will flop over rather than letting you cut through the mat if you have a poor cut. And so in a cutting tournament context, you would simply get no points for a failed cut rather than getting partial points for a cut that went through but was ugly. The point of cutting in a HEMA context is to measure how well you're performing cuts. And so tatami is a tool for giving you feedback on your edge alignment, and are you engaging your core and using sufficient power with your cuts. So a beginner would want feedback in a training context, and I think tournaments should be an extension of that training. So I would say that I don't necessarily agree with that point that it's better to have this kind of mat for beginners. So in this last video for the Wara Mats, I have another Mugen Dachi on the left, and then I have a thicker Wara mat, and it was by far the most difficult to roll. All of the Wara Mats have an issue where they have stitching on the ends, and so when you roll it, those become thick, and the middle of the tatami mat is not firmly tightly rolled, and also just the weave of the Wara mat does not really allow for a very tight roll, and so the mats tend to be floppy. So here I'm going to try some cuts through the thicker Wara mat. And you may be able to see here when I do a horizontal cut that the mat is quite loosely rolled. That was probably my third attempt to roll it. That was as tight as I could get it. It's very difficult to roll. And finally we get to the mat that stood out from the rest. From the moment I took it out of the box, I could tell it was a denser weave, much easier to roll. I had high expectations coming into this for this mat. So what you'll see me do here is attempt a 3-cut combination, double cut, on the top half of the mat, which I did in the after tournament cutting at Combat Con. So both of these mats did a good job of resisting my attempt to do that cut. But here I'm noticing that mat number 5 here, so you can see the number 5, was more difficult to cut than the Mugen Dachi. So I'm turning it to show the density of that mat, very consistent, and did in fact feel a little more difficult to cut than the Mugen Dachi. And here I want to verify that with just a simple overhow. And another. And yes, it does feel like it takes just a bit more effort to cut through. And I will do some horizontal cuts. The consistency of the mat and the way it responds to cutting reminds me a lot of used Japanese tatami. However, this mat only soaked for 12 hours and has this consistency. So that's a benefit over that type of mat, because you typically have to soak the Japanese tatami for a good bit longer. So with this type of mat, as you can see, fairly dense. It does not have the smell, nor does it have the dust that you typically find with Mugen Dachi mats. As you could tell in the video and see here, it was a little bit thicker mat and might have been a little bit longer, so it produced a little bit thicker target. The lack of dust and the lack of smell, combined with the performance characteristics as a cutting medium, I think makes this mat a very attractive potential alternative to Mugen Dachi. I hope you found this video useful, and thanks for watching.